Some places are remembered not for what they built, but for what they buried. This is the story of Mercy Bridge in Cedar Falls, where a family's car was pulled from the river, but the seats were empty, and the truth drowned deeper than the current itself. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and the time, because it's always powerful to see how far these stories travel. In 1998, a car plunged through the guardrail on Mercy Bridge in Cedar Falls. Inside were the bodies of the Mitchell family. A father, a mother, 3 children. But when divers searched the murky waters below, something didn't add up. There was a car, yes, but no bodies. Not even fragments that matched 5 people. Just enough evidence to keep the case open, and enough to fuel whispers that the Mitchells didn't die that night. They vanished. What really happened to the Mitchells? Were they victims of a tragic accident or architects of their own disappearance? Tonight, we dive into the case that haunted Cedar Falls for nearly 3 decades. This is Echoes in the Silence. If you want more stories of unsolved mysteries, shocking revelations, and buried truths, subscribe now. The fog hung thick over Mercy Bridge that November night, turning headlights into ghostly orbs. The old iron structure had claimed 3 cars in the past decade, its narrow lanes and missing guardrails a testament to the county's tight budget. But when the Mitchell family sedan broke through the eastern rail at 1:47 a.m., it wasn't weather. That sent them into the dark waters below. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb stood on the bridge at dawn, staring down at the churning current. The car had been pulled up just after sunrise, its windows shattered, doors ajar. Water poured from every opening like blood from a wound, but the seats were empty. 5 people, Webb muttered to his partner, Deputy Sanchez. David Mitchell, 44. Sarah Mitchell, 39. The kids were 15, 12, and 8 years old. Sanchez kicked at the gravel. Maybe the current took them. Webb shook his head. The river moved fast, but not fast enough to sweep away an entire family without leaving traces. He crouched by the twisted guardrail, running his fingers along the metal. The paint was scraped, but something else caught his eye. Brake marks, fresh ones, leading straight to the gap. They braked, he said, hard, right before they went over. What no one could have imagined then was that the Mitchell story wouldn't end with twisted metal and dark water. It was only beginning. Cedar Falls, present day. The town had weathered the economic storms better than most. Its main street lined with coffee shops and boutiques that catered to tourists drawn by the scenic river valley. But for Diane Carter, returning felt like walking through a museum of her own past. The same courthouse where she'd filed her first story as a cub reporter. The same bridge where the Mitchells had allegedly died. Diane parked her rental outside the Cedar Falls Gazette, the newspaper where she'd started her career before moving on to investigative work for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She sat, for a moment, watching pedestrians cross the street, their faces familiar, yet changed by 2 decades. She opened her laptop, scrolling through her notes. Mitchell family accident. November 3, 1998. Father, David, 44, insurance agent, financial. Troubles. Mother Sarah, 39, nurse. Children Jessica, 15, Tommy, 12, Amy, 8. Cause, bridge accident. Official evidence, no bodies recovered. Vehicle submerged 47 minutes. Insurance claim, $850,000 life insurance policy taken out 8 months prior. Diane tapped, her fingers against the keyboard. Her editor at the Journal hadn't been enthusiastic about this story. Too old, he'd said. Too clean-cut. But Diane had found the anomaly buried in state archives, a file marked unresolved, suspicious circumstances. She stepped out of the car, boots clicking on the sidewalk, and crossed to the newspaper office. Inside, she approached the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. "I'm looking for archive stories about the Mitchell family," Diane said. "The bridge accident in '98. The woman's expression tightened. "You're not the first reporter to come asking about that family. That story's got teeth." Diane smiled. "Maybe because it hasn't been told properly." The woman sighed and led her to a back room filled with filing cabinets. She pulled out a thick folder, setting it on a wooden desk. "Everything we published is in there, but what we didn't publish ... double quotes." She paused. "That's a different story." Inside the folder, Diane found newspaper clippings, photographs of the bridge, the car being pulled from the water. She read the first article, dated November 4th, 1998. The language was careful, sanitized. "Tragic accident, claims local family." But buried in the later coverage, she found something that made her stop. A quote from the bridge tender, now deceased. "I seen them headlights coming fast, but then they slowed down. Real deliberate like. Ain't no accident when you slow down before you hit the rail." Diane photographed the page, her heart racing. She dug deeper, finding witness statements that contradicted the official narrative. A jogger reported seeing people walking away from the bridge area that night. A gas station attendant remembered selling food and supplies to someone, matching David Mitchell's description the morning after the accident. The courthouse clock struck noon, pulling her from the files. Diane gathered copies of the key documents and walked back into the sunlight. She felt the familiar pull of a story that refused to stay buried. Back at her car, she checked her phone. A voicemail from an unknown number. She pressed play. "Miss Carter, this is Sheriff Webb, retired now. I hear you're looking into the Mitchell case. Meet me tonight, 7 o'clock, Riverside Diner on Route 9. Come alone. Some secrets need daylight to survive." The message ended with a click. Diane sat frozen, phone in hand. Webb was alive, and after all these years, he was ready to talk. She looked toward Mercy Bridge in the distance and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. This was no longer just a cold case. Someone wanted it reopened. The Riverside Diner had been serving truckers and travelers since the 1960s, its neon sign flickering against the early evening darkness. The blue letters spelling "Home Cooking" buzzed intermittently, casting shadows across the gravel parking lot. Diane arrived early, choosing a booth near the back where she could watch the door. Sheriff Webb entered at exactly 7, moving with the careful gait of a man whose knees had taken too many hits over the years. He was tall, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades looking for truth in all the wrong places. He slid into the booth across from her. "You look like a reporter," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "Is that good or bad?" "Depends on what you're reporting." He signaled the waitress for coffee. "I heard you were asking questions about the Mitchells." Diane leaned forward. "Your voicemail said some secrets need daylight." Webb's eyes were tired but sharp. 26 years I carried this. The Mitchell case wasn't what the report said. Hell, it wasn't even close. "I've read your initial incident report," Diane said. "You noted inconsistencies in the scene." He laughed dryly. "That's putting it mildly. That bridge accident was about as accidental as a bank robbery. The brake marks told one story. The physical evidence told another. And the insurance angle, double quotes." He shook his head. What about the insurance? David Mitchell took out that policy 8 months before the accident. But here's what didn't make the papers. He'd also liquidated his kids' college funds, sold off stock holdings, even pawned his wife's jewelry. Man was converting everything to cash. Asterisk Diane scribbled notes, like he was planning something, or running from something. Webb stirred his coffee slowly. David Mitchell came to see me about 2 weeks before the accident. Said he'd gotten mixed up with some people from the city. Gambling debts, loan sharks, the kind of folks who collect in pieces if you don't pay up whole. The waitress refilled their cups, and Webb waited until she was out of earshot. He told me they'd threatened his family. Said if he didn't come up with 50 grand by month's end, they'd start taking his children as collateral. Man was terrified. Why? Didn't you help him? Webb's jaw tightened. I tried. Told him to file a report. Get protection. He refused. Said going official would just put targets on all their backs. 3 days later, their car was in the river. Diane felt the weight of his words. You think they faked the accident? I think David Mitchell was smart enough to know you can't outrun certain kinds of debt. But you can disappear if you're clever about it. But the bodies were never found. Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. That's not entirely true. He slid it across the table. Look at the last photo. Diane opened the envelope. Inside were crime scene photographs from the bridge, shots of the car being recovered, and one image that made her breath catch. It was grainy, taken from a security camera at the gas station 2 miles south of the bridge. The timestamp read November 3rd, 1998, 3:22 .m. In the frame were 5 figures walking along the roadside. A man, a woman, and 3 children. Their faces were indistinct, but their heights and builds matched the Mitchell family perfectly. Gas station owner gave this to me off the record, Webb said. Never made it into the official file. By the time I tried to follow up, he'd moved away. Address unknown. Diane studied the photograph. If this is real, then the Mitchells didn't die that night. They walked away from that bridge and vanished into thin air. The diner door opened, bell chiming. A man in a worn jacket entered, scanning the room before ordering coffee to go. Nothing unusual, but Diane noticed Webb's posture stiffen. Be careful. Miss Carter, he said quietly. The people David Mitchell was running from, they've got long memories. And they don't like loose ends. The old Mitchell property sat on 5 acres of wooded land outside Cedar Falls, where a gravel driveway wound through oak trees to a modest 2-story house. The family had never returned after the accident. The county had eventually seized it, for unpaid taxes, selling it to a developer who'd never built anything. Now it stood empty, windows boarded, paint peeling from the siding. Diane parked at the edge of the property as the afternoon sun filtered through bare branches. She walked up the driveway, boots crunching on fallen leaves. The house looked smaller than she'd imagined. Its yellow siding faded to cream, its front porch sagging under the weight of neglect. She tried the front door. Locked, but one of the boards covering a side window was loose. She pried it away and climbed through. Inside, the house was frozen in time. Furniture covered with sheets, family photos still hanging on the walls. She moved through the living room, her footsteps echoing on hardwood floors. The kitchen held remnants of the family's last meals. Plates in the sink, a coffee cup on the counter, a child's drawing stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. The drawing showed a family of 5. Stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. The Mitchells was written in crayon across the top in a child's careful handwriting. Diane photographed it, her throat tightening. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, finding the children's rooms. Jessica's room was neat teenage posters of boy bands on the walls. Tommy's was cluttered with sports equipment and model airplanes. Amy's room was painted pink, stuffed animals arranged on the bed, but it was the master bedroom that stopped her cold. The dresser drawers were pulled out, empty. The closet was bare, except for a few wire hangers. Someone had packed in a hurry. Taking only essentials. She was photographing the empty closet when she heard it. A car door slamming outside. Diane froze, listening. Footsteps on gravel, coming toward the house. She crept to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. A black SUV sat in the driveway, its windows tinted. Two men in dark coats stood beside it, one pointing toward the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been careless, leaving her rental car visible from the road. She grabbed her camera and notes, moving quietly toward the back stairs. The front door creaked open. Male voices echoed through the house. "Someone's been here recently," one said. "Fresh footprints in the dust." Diane reached the kitchen, easing toward the back door. Her hand was on the knob when a voice spoke behind her. "Going somewhere?" She turned slowly. A man in his 50s stood in the doorway. Well-dressed, but with the kind of face that suggested violence was always an option. His companion joined him, younger but equally menacing. "Miss Carter, isn't it?" The older man said. "We heard you've been asking questions about the Mitchell family." Diane's mouth was dry, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm a journalist. I have a right to investigate." "Investigate what?" "A tragic accident from 26 years ago?" His smile was cold. "Some stories are better left alone." The younger man stepped closer. "Especially stories that might hurt people who are trying to live quiet lives." Diane realized what they were saying. "They're still alive." The older man's expression didn't change. "That's not for you to determine." "Where are they?" "Safe, which is more than you'll be if you keep digging." He moved toward her, and she saw the outline of a weapon under his coat. "The Mitchell family is dead, Miss Carter. The river took them. End of story. People have a right to know the truth. Truth is overrated. Survival is what matters." He stopped just out of arm's reach. "You're going to stop looking into this case. You're going to pack up and go back to Atlanta and forget you ever heard the name Mitchell. And if I don't?" His smile widened. "Then you'll discover that some accidents really are accidents. That bridge has taken 4 cars over the years. It wouldn't be unusual for it to take a 5th. The threat hung in the air like smoke." Diane felt her legs tremble, but she forced herself to stand straight. "I understand," she said. "Good. We'll be watching to make sure you do." He gestured to his companion, and they moved toward the front door. "Have a safe trip back to Atlanta, Miss Carter. Cedar Falls can be dangerous for people who don't know when to leave well enough alone." They left as quietly as they'd come. Diane waited until she heard the SUV's engine fade before moving. Her hands shook as she climbed out the side window and ran to her car. As she drove back toward town, one thought echoed in her mind. They were protecting the Mitchells, which meant the family was still out there somewhere, still hiding, still afraid. The Cedar Falls Public Library was nearly empty at closing time. Diane sat at a computer terminal in the back corner, the glow of the screen casting shadows on her face. She'd spent hours searching through databases, following paper trails. That led from Cedar Falls to a dozen other cities. The Mitchell family's disappearance had been expertly orchestrated. Bank accounts closed the day before the accident. mail forwarded to a post office box that no longer existed. Even their medical records had been transferred to a clinic that had shut down 6 months later. But digital footprints were harder to erase completely. Diane found fragments, a credit card charge in Tennessee 2 months after the accident, a utility deposit in North Carolina under Sarah Mitchell's maiden name, school enrollment records for children with the right ages in a small Virginia town, though they'd withdrawn after just 1 semester. The pattern suggested a family in constant motion, never staying anywhere long enough to be found. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop looking or join them. Diane's blood chilled. They were watching her, even here. She gathered her notes and left the library, walking quickly to her car. But as she drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, another thought began to form. The men at the Mitchell house hadn't been trying to cover up a crime. They'd been protecting the family, which meant David Mitchell's gambling debts had followed them into their new lives. And after all these years, someone was still hunting them. Back at her motel, Diane spread the timeline across her bed. 1998, the accident. 1999 to 2001, scattered sightings across the southeast. 2002 to 2010, nothing. Then, starting in 2011, a new pattern emerged: utility deposits in Oregon, school records in Washington state. And always, they moved every year or two, never settling, never stopping. She pulled up missing persons databases, cross-referencing ages and descriptions. Most of the entries were too old, but one caught her attention. Family of 5 reported. Missing from Portland apartment. Landlord found belongings, but no signs of struggle. The date was 6 months ago. Diane's pulse quickened. If the timeline was right, the Mitchells were still running, still hiding, still afraid. And something had forced them to run again recently. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted message. If you want the truth about the Mitchells, meet me tomorrow at midnight. The old grain elevator on Factory Road. Come alone. No signature, but the message was routed through multiple servers, the kind of digital anonymity that took expertise to maintain. Diane closed the laptop, her heart racing. Someone wanted to talk. The question was whether they wanted to help her find the truth or bury her with it. The grain elevator had been abandoned for 15 years, its concrete tower rising like a monument to the town's agricultural past. Diane parked a quarter-mile away, walking through tall grass toward the structure. The November wind cut through her jacket, carrying the scent of frost and decay. A figure waited in the shadow of the elevator. A woman in her 50s, thin and nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. Miss Carter? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. My name is Janet Morse. I was Sarah Mitchell's best friend. Diane's breath caught. You knew them. Janet nodded. I helped them disappear. They moved deeper into the shadows, where Janet's face was barely visible in the moonlight. David came to me 3 days before the accident. He was terrified, shaking. Said the men he owed money to had been by the house, had threatened to take the children. He begged me to help them get away. How? My late husband worked for the railroad. I knew about the old routes, the abandoned stations where freight cars sat for weeks. David had liquidated everything, but it wasn't enough to pay his debts. It was enough to buy them new identities and transportation. Janet's voice trembled. The night of the accident, I drove them to the bridge. David sent the car over while Sarah and the kids waited in the woods. Then I took them to a freight yard 20 miles north. They caught a boxcar heading for Tennessee. Diane scribbled notes in the darkness. But why come forward now? Janet's shoulders sagged, because they found them again. Last month, Sarah called me from Oregon. Said the men in suits were back, asking questions, getting close. She was terrified. They'd have to run again, but the kids are adults now. Jessica has her own family. Tommy's in college. Amy just graduated high school. They're tired of running. Where are they now? I don't know. Sarah hung up before she could tell me. That was 5 weeks ago. I haven't heard from them since. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass around. Them. Janet wrapped her arms around herself. I've lived with this guilt for 26 years, she said, watching the town mourn them, seeing the memorial services. But they were good people caught in something terrible. They didn't deserve to die for David's mistakes. The men who've been watching me, Diane said. Do you know who they work for? Janet shook her head. David called them the consortium. Said they weren't just loan sharks. They were something bigger. People who made problems disappear, usually by making the people disappear too. A car engine echoed in the distance, growing closer. Both women tensed. I have to go, Janet whispered. She pressed a piece of paper into Diane's hand. That's Sarah's maiden name and her mother's address in Florida. If they're anywhere, they might be there. Janet melted back into the darkness, leaving Diane alone with the sound of her own heartbeat. She unfolded the paper. Sarah Kellerman. Grace Kellerman, 1847 Magnolia Street, St. Augustine, FL. The engine sound faded, but Diane didn't move for several minutes. She was close now, closer than anyone had been in decades. But she could also feel the weight of invisible eyes, the sense that every step forward brought her deeper into something that had already claimed too many lives. The drive to Florida took 14 hours, but Diane couldn't risk flying. Commercial. Travel left digital footprints, and she'd learned to assume that someone was always watching. She drove through the night, switching rental cars twice, paying cash for everything. SD. Augustine's Magnolia Street was lined with small cottages painted in pastels, their yards thick with Spanish moss and flowering bushes. Number 1847 was pale blue with white shutters, a swing on the front porch where an elderly woman sat reading. Diane parked across the street, watching. The woman was in her 70s, with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested former strength now battling age. She looked up as a mail carrier approached, smiling as she took a stack of letters. This had to be Grace Kellerman. Sarah Mitchell's mother. Diane crossed the street, composing her approach. She couldn't be direct. Too many people had been hurt already by careless questions. Mrs. Kellerman? She called as she reached the gate. The woman looked up, wariness immediately clouding her features. Yes, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm a journalist working on a story about families who've gone missing. I was hoping you might be willing to share some thoughts about the challenges families face when they have to disappear. Grace's grip tightened. On her book, I don't talk to reporters, I understand. But sometimes telling the truth is the only way to find safety. Grace studied her for a long moment. What kind of story? About the people who force families to vanish. About the cost of survival. Something in Grace's expression shifted. She glanced up and down the street, then gestured toward the porch. You'd better come up here. They sat on the swing, the chains creaking softly. You're here about Sarah, Grace said. It wasn't a question. Diane nodded. I know about the bridge, about what really happened. Grace's eyes filled with tears. 26 years I've mourned a daughter who wasn't dead. 26 years of watching the news, scanning faces in crowds, hoping for just a glimpse. Have you seen her? Twice. Once in 2005, she came here for 3 days. Looked thin, scared, but the children were growing up beautiful. The second time was 2018. Just her and Amy, who was finishing high school somewhere in Oregon. Sarah had aged terribly, all that fear eating her from the inside. Grace wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. She told me they'd never be safe. That the men who destroyed David's life would never stop looking. Said it was better for everyone if I believed she was dead. But you didn't. A mother knows. When your child dies, something breaks inside you that never heals. I never felt that break. Diane leaned forward. Mrs. Kellerman, I believe your daughter and her family are in immediate danger. I've been threatened to stop investigating, which means someone knows I'm getting close. Grace's face paled. Sarah called me last month. Said they'd been found. Again, had to move. She was terrified. Said this time felt different. More urgent. Did she say where they were going? Grace hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a postcard. It showed a lighthouse against a rocky coast. The postmark was from Maine, dated 3 weeks ago. On the back, in careful handwriting, still looking for the light, love always S. Pemaquid Point, Grace whispered. Sarah and I visited there when she was a child. She always said if she ever needed to find peace, she'd go back to that lighthouse. Diane studied the postcard. It wasn't much, but it was the first solid lead she'd had in weeks. Mrs. Kellerman, I need you to understand something. The people looking for your daughter, they're dangerous. If they find out I've been here, then you'd better find her first. Grace's voice was steady, because I'm too old to lose her again. Maine in late November was a symphony of gray. Gray sky, gray. Ocean, gray rocks worn smooth by decades of storms. Diane drove the coastal highway toward Pemaquid Point, her rental car fighting against wind that seemed determined to push her back toward the road she'd come from. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory, its white tower stark against the overcast sky. A few tourists braved the cold, taking pictures and reading the historical markers. But most of the parking area was empty. Diane parked and walked toward the lighthouse, scanning the faces of the few visitors. None matched the aged progression photos she'd created of the Mitchell family. But then, she hadn't really expected them to be standing in the open. She explored the gift shop, the keeper's house, the rocky trails that wound around the point. Nothing. But as she was walking back to her car, a voice called out, "You're looking for someone." Diane turned. Park ranger in his 60s stood beside a maintenance shed, holding a rake. "Just sightseeing," she said carefully. "Sightseers don't scan faces like cops do." His smile was knowing. "Or journalists. You're the one who's been asking questions about the family that went in the river, aren't you?" Diane felt her heart skip. How do you word travels? Small towns talk to each other, especially when strangers start stirring up old secrets. He leaned the rake against the shed. Name's Bill Crawford. I've been working these parks for 37 years. Have you seen them? Crawford glanced around, then motioned for her to follow him away from the lighthouse. They walked to a secluded spot overlooking the ocean. Family of 5 came through here about 2 weeks ago, he said. Adults in their 60s, young woman in her 20s. They didn't match any description exactly, but there was something about them. The way they moved together, protective-like. The way they kept looking over their shoulders. Where are they now? Rented a cabin about 10 miles north. Paid cash for a month, but they've been keeping to themselves. Local grocery store says they send the youngest one in for supplies, never more than basic necessities. Diane pulled out her notebook. Can you show me where? Crawford hesitated. Miss, I don't know what these folks are running from, but they're scared. Real scared. You sure you want to bring whatever's chasing them right to their door? Someone has to stop this. They've been running for 26 years. Their children have grown up without stability, without safety. Don't they deserve a chance at a normal life? Crawford studied her for a long moment. Follow Shore Road north about 8 miles. You'll see a turnoff marked Pine Ridge Cabins. They're in number 7, set back in the woods. The cabin was more isolated than Diane had expected. Pine Ridge turned out to be a collection of rustic structures scattered through dense forest, connected by narrow dirt roads. Number 7 sat at the end of a winding track, smoke rising from its chimney. Diane parked 50 yards away, behind a stand of trees. Through the windows, she could see movement inside. Shadows passing back and forth. The careful choreography of people who'd learned to be constantly vigilant. She approached slowly, hands. Visible, footsteps deliberately loud so as not to startle anyone inside. She knocked on the door. Mr. Mitchell? My name is Diane Carter. I'm a journalist, and I know what happened at Mercy Bridge. Silence. Then the sound of hushed voices, urgent whispers. I'm not here to expose you, she called through the door. I'm here to help. More whispers. Then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened slowly, revealing a man who looked far older than his 68 years. His hair was white, his face lined with decades of stress, but his eyes were unmistakably intelligent and alert. David Mitchell, she said softly. He nodded once. How did you find us? Your mother-in-law, the postcard. His shoulders sagged. Behind him, Diane could see a woman who had to be Sarah, and in the shadows, a younger woman with Sarah's eyes and cheekbones. Amy, the youngest child. You've brought them here, David said, not accusingly but with the weary certainty of a man who'd been found too many times. Not yet, Diane said. But they're close. That's why I need to tell your story. The only way. To stop running is to shine light on the people chasing you. Sarah stepped forward. She was thin, her hair prematurely gray, but her voice was steady. We can't go public. You don't understand what these people are capable of. I've been threatened too, Diane said. I know they're dangerous, but hiding hasn't stopped them from finding you. Amy spoke up, her voice young but tired. What about Jessica and Tommy? David's face cracked. Jessica lives in Seattle, under the name Carter. She has 2 children who don't know their real last name. Tommy's in graduate school in Vermont, also with false papers. We haven't seen them in 3 years, because contact is too dangerous. Diane felt the weight of their sacrifice. An entire family scattered, living under assumed names, afraid to be together. The consortium, she said. Tell me about them. David's jaw tightened. Not loan sharks, something worse. They buy debt, then use it to control people. Force them into illegal activities, money laundering, sometimes worse. When I tried to get out, they made it clear my family would pay the price. So you staged the accident. Sarah nodded. Janet Morse helped us disappear, but we always knew it was temporary. Men like that don't give up. They have long memories and longer reach. Through the window, Diane caught a glimpse of headlights winding up the dirt road. We need to go, David said, moving immediately toward the back of the cabin. Now, but it was too late. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the trees, followed by the crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves. Mr. Mitchell, a voice called from outside. We know you're in there. Time to settle some old business. David grabbed a shotgun from a closet. Sarah and Amy moved toward the back door. But before they could escape, the front door exploded inward. 3 men entered, well-dressed and armed. The leader was the same man who'd confronted Diane in the Mitchell house back in Cedar Falls. 26 years is a long time to wait, he said to David. But we're patient people. I don't owe you anything, David replied, the shotgun steady in his hands. Interest compounds, Mr. Mitchell. Your original debt of $50,000 is now worth considerably more. Diane realized she was still holding her phone, video recording everything. The red light blinked steadily. Miss Carter, the man said, noticing the device. Still asking questions you shouldn't ask. The world has a right to know, she said. The world has a right to order. His voice was cold. Your story ends here. But Amy had been moving quietly along the wall. In one quick motion, she grabbed a heavy lamp and swung it at the nearest gunman. The room erupted in chaos. The shotgun blast was deafening. Sarah screamed. Men shouted. And in the confusion, Diane saw her chance. She ran, crashing through the back door and into the forest. Behind her, she could hear more gunshots, shouts, the sound of pursuit. She reached her car and fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. The engine turned over just as flashlight beams cut through the trees. As she drove away, her phone still in her hand with the video intact, she could hear sirens in the distance. Someone had called for help, but she also knew it might be too late. The Maine State Police found 3 bodies in Pine Ridge cabin number 7. 2 were identified as members of a criminal organization with ties to illegal gambling and loan sharking operations. The 3rd was David Mitchell, 68, whose fingerprints matched records from a car accident in Cedar Falls in 1998. No other bodies were recovered from the scene. Diane watched the news coverage from her hotel room in Portland, her laptop open to the video files she'd recorded. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show the confrontation, the threats. Violence that had finally caught up with a family that had spent decades running. But it didn't show what happened to Sarah, and Amy. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Miss Carter? The voice was familiar. Sarah Mitchell. You're alive. Barely. David didn't make it. He stayed behind so Amy and I could escape. Diane closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that sacrifice. Where are you now? Safe for the moment. But we can't stay here, and we can't keep running. Not anymore. What do you want me to do? Tell our story, all of it. The debt, the disappearance, the 26 years of hiding. Make sure people know what the consortium does to families. Sarah, if I publish this, you'll never be able to hide again. Good. I'm tired of hiding. Amy's tired of hiding. Jessica and Tommy deserve to know their real names. And maybe, if enough people know the truth, these men will finally face consequences. Diane opened her laptop, began typing. What was the name of the man who threatened you? The leader? Vincent Caruso. He runs the Northeast operations for the consortium. David always said he was untouchable, but maybe that was just because no one ever tried to touch him. 3 months later, Diane's investigation ran as a 6-part series in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Echoes in the Silence. The Mitchell family's 26-year flight from justice detailed every aspect of the case, from the staged bridge accident to the final confrontation in Maine. The series included the video footage from the cabin, witness testimony from Janet Morse and Sheriff Webb, and financial records proving the consortium's involvement in illegal debt collection operations. Vincent Caruso was arrested 2 weeks after the series concluded. Federal agents raided consortium offices in 7 states, seizing records that implicated dozens of operatives in extortion, money laundering, and murder. The organization that had terrorized the Mitchell family for nearly 3 decades began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. But the victory came at a cost that Diane carried with her every day. Sarah and Amy Mitchell emerged from hiding to testify at Caruso's trial. Jessica flew in from Seattle with her children, meeting her mother and sister for the first time in 5 years. Tommy left graduate school to join them. The family finally reunited after decades of separation. They sat together in the front row of the courthouse, holding hands as Caruso received a life sentence without parole. David Mitchell wasn't there to see justice served, but his sacrifice had made it possible. The cemetery in Cedar Falls was quiet. On the afternoon, they finally laid David Mitchell to rest. His gravestone was simple: David Mitchell, 1954 to 2024. Beloved husband and father. He never stopped protecting his family. Sarah placed a single white rose on the grave. 26 years, she whispered. He gave us 26 years we wouldn't have had. Diane stood with the family, notebook closed, camera put away. Some moments were too sacred for documentation. Around them, townspeople gathered, neighbors who had mourned the Mitchell family in 1998, now celebrating their survival in 2024. Sheriff Webb, now in his 80s, placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. He was a good man caught in bad circumstances, he said, but he found a way to save what mattered most. As the service ended, Amy approached Diane. She was 26 now, the same age her father had been when the deaths first began. But unlike David, she faced the future without fear. "Thank you," Amy said simply. "For what?" "For giving us our names back, for letting us stop running." Diane watched the Mitchell family walk away together, no longer looking over their shoulders, no longer afraid of the cars that passed or the strangers who glanced their way. They moved with the easy grace of people who belonged in the world again. Her phone buzzed with a text from her editor. "Great work on the Mitchell story. What's next?" Diane looked one last time at David's grave, then at the family disappearing into the distance. She typed back, "Justice doesn't always look like we expect. Sometimes it looks like a father who chose love over fear, and a family that refused to let his sacrifice be in vain." The bridge over Cedar Falls had been repaired since 1998, its guardrails reinforced, its narrow lanes widened for safety. But Diane still slowed as she drove across it on her way out of town. She thought about the car that had gone through the rail that foggy November night, about the man who had chosen to disappear rather than watch his family suffer. Below, the river ran dark and steady, carrying its secrets toward the sea. But some secrets, Diane had learned, were meant to be brought into the light dot in her rearview mirror. She could see the town of Cedar Falls growing smaller, its streets and buildings fading into memory. But the story would remain, a testament to the lengths people would go to protect the ones they loved, and to the power of truth to set even the most hunted souls free. The radio played softly as she drove south, carrying her toward new stories, new mysteries, new chances to shine light into dark corners. Behind her, the Mitchell family began their first day in 26 years, without looking over their shoulders. The echoes and the silence had finally found their voice.